Assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Mustafa Yar Hiraj, and it is my distinct pleasure to be welcoming you all as the president of the LSESU Pakistan Development Society. Our society has, since its inception, strived to stimulate discourse about the socio-economic conditions of Pakistan and provide students with a platform to engage with a diverse set of views regarding the issues that Pakistan and its large overseas community faces. In this regard, we have hosted numerous conferences and events over the last few years in order to facilitate fruitful discussion about Pakistan. The core purpose of the society has been to explore Pakistan's political and development agenda on the international platform that benefits people both inside and outside the country through embracing diversity of perspectives. In this regard, we are honored to be hosting our flagship event, the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2020, which is the largest student-run developmental forum on Pakistan in Europe that provides a platform to connect students, experts, and government ministers. In the LSE spirit, we organize sessions geared towards critical thinking about the challenges that Pakistan currently faces, as well as the solutions that ought to be explored for the future. In past editions, we have had the honor of hosting many distinguished personalities, including a sitting Prime Minister, an incumbent Supreme Court Justice, several politicians, businessmen, and other key stakeholders. The LSE Future of Pakistan Conference is being organized this year with the objectives of unpacking Pakistan's development agenda to the international community, connecting some of the brightest students with policymakers and professors, and enabling them to hold both past and present governments to account in respect of manifesto commitments and campaign promises. This time around, we will be hosting three panels: fundamental rights, foreign policy, and the economy of Pakistan, all of which will revolve around a central theme that is Naya Pakistan, a new social contract between citizens and the state. Of course, normally we would have been sitting somewhere in the Sheikh Zayed Theatre at the LSE, but because of the hurdles and ever changing environment that the COVID 19 pandemic has created, here we are hosting our conference over Zoom. On that note, I would like to say that it has been extremely challenging for my society to organize this conference in a digital environment, which we are all continuing to struggle with, despite having no choice but to get used to it. I would especially like to thank my team, who has put in a lot of effort, done numerous mock sessions with me over Zoom, and tried to plan out all the logistics to the best of their abilities. I would also like to thank the LSE South Asia Center, especially Dr. Nilanjan Sarkar, for his help and support throughout the lead up to our event. A special mention also goes to the LSE Students Union, whose efforts of providing us with unwavering support deserve as much gratitude as we can give. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our first panel at the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2020. Our first panel on fundamental rights will explore whether fundamental freedoms are merely an aspiration rather than a bundle of rights that are enforceable by all citizens. Is it time to reform the culture of public administration? For this discussion, we have three very highly respected speakers joining us today, and I'm grateful to all of you for taking out the time and choosing to be a part of our conference. Our first speaker on the fundamental rights panel is none other than Dr. Shireen Mazari, Pakistan's Federal Minister for Human Rights. Dr. Shireen Mazari studied at the LSE before pursuing a master's, MPhil, and PhD at Columbia University. She has been a part of various think tanks, including the Institute of Strategic Studies, where she also served as its Director General. She has served as the consultant on defense and security, editor-in-chief and publisher of Pulse Weekly, as well as chairperson and associate professor at Quaid-e-Azam University. Being a senior member of the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, she was elected to the National Assembly in 2013 and again in 2018. Upon becoming Federal Minister for Human Rights, Dr. Shireen Mazari has led the country in making significant progress in terms of reviewing and strengthening laws, rules, and regulations affecting the status of women in Pakistan. She has always been at the forefront of criticizing human rights violations globally, and quite recently, she even spearheaded the drafting and approval of anti-rape legislation from the federal cabinet. We are delighted to host Dr. Shireen Mazari at the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2020. Next, we have with us a very seasoned politician and a senior advocate of the Supreme Court of Pakistan. A Cambridge University alum, Barrister Aitzaz Ahsan has spent his entire life trying to strengthen the country's democratic system and empower civilian institutions. His leadership of the 2007 movement to restore the judiciary in Pakistan, where he represented the then suspended Chief Justice and successfully got him restored, is just a small part of his abundant contributions to the country. As a veteran PPP politician, he has served various cabinet positions and also held the esteemed offices of Leader of the House and later as Leader of the Opposition in the Senate. Throughout his career as a lawyer, Barrister Aitzaz Ahsan has represented a wide variety of clients, ranging from prime ministers, senior politicians, and top businessmen, to even minorities and women, including those who have been victim to domestic violence and rape. We are delighted to host Barrister Aitzaz Ahsan at the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2020. Introducing our final speaker on the Fundamental Rights panel, Ms. Reema Omer, a young, highly qualified legal expert who currently serves as a Senior Legal Advisor South Asia at the International Commission of Jurists. Ms. Reema Omer completed her LLM at the University of Cambridge in 2009 and was later awarded the Commonwealth Pegasus Scholarship in 2010. She is also a member of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan. Her legal acumen and drive for change can be seen not only through her work at the ICJ, but also through the articles that she frequently writes for both national and international publications, specifically on human rights. Some of her famous pieces include Defining Hate Speech, where she stresses on the importance of freedom of expression, as well as her discussion of Article 184.3 and the Supreme Court's jurisdiction. We are delighted to host Ms. Reema Omer at the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2020. Last but not least, I would like to introduce our moderator for this session, Raza Nazar, a lawyer at Slaughter & May, which is one of the most prestigious law firms in the world. He made global headlines when he became the first and only Pakistani to be inducted into the UK's top 5 future lawyers list in 2017. A rising star, Raza has been quoted and interviewed by renowned news outlets, including BBC News and The Times, for his analysis on landmark UK Supreme Court judgments on constitutional law. In 2018, Raza graduated with a double first in law from the London School of Economics. Raza is also the founder of the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference. With that said, I think we should not keep you all waiting for any longer, so let's get right to it. Over to you, Raza.
Thanks very much, Mustafa. Let's think about fundamental rights. Why do human rights matter? I mean, we have a very diverse audience and people tuning in from all over the world. But to put it briefly, human rights can mean different things. There's freedom to do things, such as freedom to move in and out of one's country, freedom to assemble and peaceful protest, freedom to express yourself and give your views on certain things. But there's also freedom from things, such as freedom from torture, freedom from slavery, and the like. In the Pakistan context, fundamental freedoms are provided under the Constitution of Pakistan and are an important means of protection for all Pakistan citizens, especially those who face abuse, neglect, and oppression. Fundamental rights are based on the premise that every human life has equal worth. And while human dignity is the premise of fundamental rights, they're also important on an international plane. Pakistan, in particular, its obligations in terms of human rights are linked to international treaties, but also other systems of economic benefits, such as the EU's trade incentives under the GSP+. So fundamental rights are very intricate, they are diverse, and they're provided under Pakistan's constitution. But Pakistan has had a mixed experience with regards to fundamental rights. And we're going to unpack this as part of our discussion today. We're going to start with looking at the question of the existence and protection of fundamental rights being two different questions. We're all aware that Pakistan's constitution provides for fundamental rights, but in reality, in practice, in terms of its enforcement, are fundamental rights simply a mere aspiration as opposed to a bundle of enforceable rights for every Pakistan citizen? The different issues with respect to this And probably one of the most recent cases under the present government is looking at the case in Lahore, where arrest orders were issued when students were mobilizing because they endangered the public peace, law and order situation. Amarli Jan, an academic, was on the radar of the Deputy Commissioner for highlighting issues that students faced in Pakistan. Yes, the Lahore High Court eventually stepped in and deemed it plainly unconstitutional, but the fact that Jan's efforts were disrupted so easily is a serious cause for concern. We have freedom of assembly, as well as many other rights under the Constitution. But does that really mean anything if in practice they aren't enforced by police and state officials? With that sort of scoping opening question, I'm going to put it to the panel and invite Ms. Reema Omer to talk about the distinction and then think about, in Pakistan, are these just an aspirational commitment as opposed to actual rights?
Thanks very much, Raza, and to the organizers for holding this conference in the time of COVID and also for inviting me. The issues you've highlighted are very close to my heart, not just in Pakistan, but elsewhere as well. I think this is a question people are asking, that various constitutions in the world protect human rights, but are people living in those countries truly benefiting from them? One point of contention at the start, human rights are not just for citizens, they're also for residents, people residing in the country. And I think we can come to this later. I think it's problematic that Pakistan's constitution, for some rights, such as freedom to speech or assembly, they restrict those rights to citizens only. Under the international human rights framework, that is states not fulfilling their obligations to protect the rights of all people who are residing within their territory. So maybe this is something we can come to later when we speak about how our constitution can be improved. My big cause of concern, like you rightly pointed out, fundamental rights are there in our constitution. They're meant to be enforced. Our constitution says any law that is repugnant to fundamental rights has no validity. The Supreme Court, every other institution of the state has to enforce human rights. But yes, a lot of people do not benefit from it, and we don't have that culture of enforcement. But my big cause of concern is that in recent years, we've seen that in public discourse, human rights are not even considered an aspiration. We see a lot of sort of fight back from various quarters that should human rights even be protected? Should certain people who do not meet the definition of an ideal victim, be it people who are accused of corruption, people who are accused of terrorism, people who are accused of sexual violence, do they deserve human rights? And people who talk about their fundamental freedoms, their right to fair trial, their right to speech, they're attacked as being apologists for terrorists, for the corrupt, for people who are perpetrators of sexual violence. That for me is a bigger concern than enforcement, because I feel now the entire question of whether everyone who is living in Pakistan is entitled to those fundamental freedoms that the Constitution guarantees, that in itself has been questioned. And I find that very dangerous when, for example, a minister who stands in parliament and says, people who are corrupt in this country should be dragged, should be tied to jeeps, and then they should be tortured, and then they should be publicly hanged. This is something we're hearing from parliament. We also hear others talk about how people who commit rape do not deserve trials. They should just be picked up and they should be hanged publicly. So all this kind of discourse that we see, and I can understand it. I mean, there are a lot of issues that this country faces. Sexual violence is particularly heinous. It upsets us. But this is the time when stressing on the importance of fundamental rights is so crucial. But we see that from the top, messaging is very mixed. So it seems like the entire idea of human rights as an aspiration even, we have restricted it to a few people who we like, people we want to hear, people who we think are good. And I've also heard on television, this being said by a lot of analysts, human rights belong to humans. People who commit crimes, people who commit terrorism, for example, they're not human. so they do not deserve human rights. I mean, this is also a line from a Bollywood film. I think Salman Khan said this in one of his films when he said, human rights are not for animals, and these people are animals, so they deserve no human rights. And, we see these extrajudicial executions, torture, and the like being defended in public discourse, in films, everywhere on these grounds. So yes, human rights are there in the Constitution as enforceable rights. They are not enforced, but now we see even the question of human rights as an aspiration is under attack.
Thanks. That's an excellent point, Ms. Reema Omer. I think I want to bring in Barrister Aitzaz Ahsan on this specific issue. What is your thoughts on the point being made that human rights aren't even an aspiration in Pakistan, and that there is a selective application of rights based on who we deem worthy of actually deserving rights?
Well, actually, this aspiration and the actuality of rights, there is, of course, a schism in that. There is a divide that one is real and the other is, as you express it, aspirational, as the scoping question also takes it up, the first question. It's a very fundamental issue. Rights are not rights if they are not available. If they are available only in the Constitution, on the pages of the Constitution, and not actually on ground, and not available to the citizen, and as Reema said, persons otherwise who are in Pakistan, they have certain fundamental rights also, despite the fact that they are not citizens. Although the citizens have a few more rights, fundamental rights than persons who are, for the time being, in Pakistan. For instance, a Pakistani citizen cannot be handcuffed and thrown out of the country or made stateless just because the government thinks so, without an extradition treaty, without having committed a crime abroad. You can't just deprive a Pakistani citizen of his territory or his citizenship, or which you can to a person who is not of Pakistani origin or not a Pakistani national. But that's a part. This is the big question. The big question is, is it sufficient to have fundamental rights in the Constitution when they are not actually actuated on the ground, and the citizen does not have the benefit of that? In Pakistan, I think we have too much of that, this dichotomy and this division, the contrast. We have elaborate fundamental rights. And in the more recent 2010 18th Amendment, more fundamental rights were added, like the right of education, the right of information, specifically in the Constitution. And they are rights that actually are not actuated. The right to education is a resource-based right. So it's easy to argue against that, but the state has to provide some level of free education and compulsory education to the citizen. But I think the deeper issue and question is, the fact is that while the constitutional fundamental rights, if you look at them, if you look at start with Article 8, they bind the state. There is no such comparative sort of dictate with regard to binding the society. The state is bound by the Articles 8 to 28, which includes the fundamental rights. But actually, while the state shall not, I will not do anything that I'm not allowed to do under any one of several laws, including the law on crimes, which is the Pakistan Penal Code, or the company's law if I'm a corporate entity, etc., or the banking laws. But The society as such is in a different age, unfortunately. We remain patriarchal and I think, and I must say, confess, medieval in many respects. I'll refer to one case recently, which has come to conclusion, but has been looming over the human rights debate for the last 20 years, was the Mukhtar Mai case. Now, in Supreme Court, in dismissing her appeal, make a very peculiar observation, the majority judgment. The minority judgment accepts her version, but the majority judgment, by a majority of one, say, for instance, and I would invite actually Dr. Mazari and Reema to look at that, the Mukhtar Mai judgment. There hasn't been much comment. I have occasionally commented upon it, but it says really, and this is just, you just hold on. It says that Mukhtar Mai, who was a divorcee, cannot be given the same credibility and credit in her testimony as if she had been a virgin. Now, this is what the judgment says. The judgment going against Mukhtar Mai. Had she been not married and had she not been divorced, she would have got more credit and she would have been a more credible witness, more believable witness than she is having been married and having been somehow used to the sexual act itself. Now, where does this come from? It is not written in the law. I find it nowhere in the law. But this is what the judgment actually, in discrediting the prosecutrix, which is Mukhtar Mai, in giving a justification of not believing her version entirely. This is what the court says. And I think there should have been and should be an outrage against such things. But we have this dichotomy, one, of the fundamental rights on paper, and two, the fundamental rights in the field. Particularly bereft of fundamental rights is the women of Pakistan. And the woman becomes the target of actually vengeance and revenge, of the men becoming equal in their power and authority with respect to the rivals, and the women get traded. They still do. Secondly, it's in crimes concerning women, it's a simple thing to compromise. It is as if the woman is not a human being. In fact, I submit, and I've been saying this for a long time, the problem with Pakistan is that half the population is a problem. It's not, we do not discuss women's problems. The woman is a problem with a capital P in her person. And that person, the other half of the population is preoccupied in debating that problem and can my daughter marry of her own free will? Can she go out to a school which is a co-educational school? And all these other matters. Can she work in a place? What about parda? Woman is a problem, and we have to solve that problem, resolve it amongst ourselves. And if we can't, then we will kill for honor, our honor, not her honor, our honor. Now, this is a despicable situation prevailing more in a lot of South Asia and a lot of other places, a little retarded, and we have this situation also. So I think there has to be let me conclude my intervention for this for the moment. We have to actually focus not so much on the dots and commas of the Constitution providing fundamental rights as much as on the societal reaction and societal embrace or non-rejection of the fundamental rights regime in their mindset and in as a normal reaction to a given situation. The first thing that should come into mind is that there's something has to be done and there has been a human rights violation. But if it involves a woman, it's normally not considered as a human rights situation. So I think that we have to address this particular flaw and drawback in our society and its reactions. The police sub-inspector is from our society. He will react. He joins the aggressor party, the male patriarchy, and believes in that himself. He's been brought up that way. And in the home, in the school, in the society, we have to make sure that women are that our attitudes towards women change, and our attitudes towards crime generally changes, and our attitudes towards application of human rights changes and becomes a first priority and recognizable by every man when there has been a violation.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for those remarks, Aitzaz Saab. I think you raise an excellent point as to the loss of agency for the women of Pakistan, and it's been a perpetual issue since conception, perhaps not just an isolated issue with Pakistan, but indeed South Asia and most parts of the world. I think I want to bring in Dr. Shireen Mazari at this point. We've heard from both panelists, Ms. Reema Omer talks about there being a dichotomy, the type that Barrister Saab talks about, this dichotomy of aspiration versus enforcement. But I think Ms. Reema Omer goes a step further because she says that we're not even there at the point in which fundamental rights are even an aspiration in Pakistan because they are selectively looked at, selectively enforced. So isn't that a fundamental problem, Dr. Shireen Mazari?
Thank you, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First, I want to begin by saying, obviously, there are rights, as everybody has pointed out, in our constitution. That's what we aspire to be. That's the goal. Also, Pakistan is signatory to a number of human rights conventions. So that is our international obligation also to bring our laws and implement what we have committed to. But to say that we're not even aspiring for human rights, I would beg to differ. I think that we should not go by statements, whether they're made in parliament or otherwise. We should go by actions. So while, yes, people are very angry, including legislators, about the way rape and child sexual abuse, rape, gang rape has been happening. And because of social media, there is more publicity, more awareness, more news about it. So people have stood up and said, hang people in public, they deserve no justice, and so on. But the fact of the matter is that's not what the state has legislated to do. Our most recent anti-rape ordinance does not have public hangings in it. In fact, it's very interesting because women have collectively recently demanded a charter of rights relating to sexual abuse and protection. And the new ordinance, in fact, includes a lot of their demands. For example, getting rid of this horrible two-finger test, protection of victims, and so on. So, and there's no way is there any public hanging or drag them in the streets. Public, look, if you talk about the right to expression, as long as people do not get violent, you should not, you can't stop people from speaking their mind. So I think that we have to make a distinction between that. Where I do see a problem is that for years, especially with the sort of suspensions of the constitution that we have had, the long periods of dictatorship, the people's commitment, frankly, the ordinary citizens' commitment to basic human rights across the board have not been there. And but I'll tell you a reflection of that. The Ministry of Human Rights was only created at the end of 2015. Otherwise, it was with law and justice. And the approach that Pakistan adopted was a social welfare approach. And our approach in our ministry has always been from day one. And whether we're talking about persons with disabilities, whether we're talking about children or women, I always make the point we are doing no favor to any citizen. It is their right to have their basic fundamentals, their rights that are enshrined in the Constitution, and we have to adopt a rights-based approach. I am not saying we're at an ideal spot, far from it. There is a vast room for improvement. But I think, and I'm optimistic, that we are getting there. For example, apart from the anti-rape ordinance and amendments in the PPC, which I think have now made a very strong law against commission of rape, and also because there's going to be a crisis cell, post-trauma, psychiatric help for victims and so on. I think this is a big step forward, especially, as I said, the ending of the two-finger test. The other thing is that we are now, for example, talking openly about child sexual abuse. It was a taboo subject. But I know we have formed teams, we go educate children, we have videos, we talk to parents, we have created apps which can be downloaded and cases reported. So child sexual abuse also is being is a part of the new anti-rape ordinance that has come about. So what we are seeing is creating an awareness amongst people that no subject is taboo. If people are denied their rights, if the law is not being enforced, we need implementation. We have a number of very progressive laws. The problem is implementation. And then to go back to something that Aitzaz said, awareness, changing people's mindsets. That, you see, child abuse, the law will come into operation once a crime has been committed. Why is it committed so frequently? So mindsets have to change also. So we have to work on multiple fronts. And I think that because we are committed to improving and delivering on human rights, so the aspiration, at least on our parts, is there. I think for the first time, this government and our ministry has actually opened a debate on enforced disappearances. I don't recall any government before that. Our ministry has framed a bill on it. Yes, it's still with the law ministry and stuck in places, but the Prime Minister has now formed a committee to look at enforced disappearance and see how quickly we can end this whole procedure and criminalize enforced disappearances. This was something that governments never took up. So if there was no sense of aspiration, I think we would not be dealing with these issues. And so I think that in that part, there is and the other development that has been is that people are becoming more aware and people are speaking out. For example, now we have realized that we need to protect the journalist community. There is a very progressive journalist protection bill in final stages of going through, unfortunately, between parliamentary democracy and standing committees where delays happen and our own bureaucratic procedures. It takes a while, but there has been a general agreement now amongst the interministerial departments that are responsible that the journalist protection bill must be brought forward. So these are issues. Then we also have, because we have interpretation of fundamental rights by the courts, we have seen some very progressive jurisprudence develop. For example, if you look at the Myra Sajid case on enforced disappearances, I think the Islamabad High Court created two really good precedences. One was truth and two was compensation. So we will be having to move forward on that. So things are happening. Yes, we've also had a very bizarre decision from the Lahore High Court on the COVID-19 slogan that the government had, that Daro Mat Lado, and they said the slogan is un-Islamic. And what do you do with that? So yes, we have that happening as well. But I think through the chaos, or we will, because human rights have become such a central focus, we are going to be moving forward. It takes time and people get impatient. And I totally agree. There are efforts like the Amar Jan case, which was absolutely wrong, should not have happened. And there was an outcry, at least in the federal cabinet, on it. And there are these things that continue to happen because the law is not enforced effectively. And also, I want to add that here we're talking about politically sensitive issues which are controversial, but and they come up for debate. But also look at other basic human rights, provision of health services. Now the government of Pakistan is providing extensive, overall health coverage for every citizen. In Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, they've already done it, the health card and the health insurance scheme. This is a first. For the ordinary man in the street, he wants health, he wants education. These are things that we have to provide. One of the reasons that during COVID, we had a better experience in the first phase than our neighbor in India is because of the Aitzaz program, where people who were marginalized or who would suffer the most were given cash so that they could bolster against the threat of extreme poverty. So there are things that are happening. I would be the last person to say that this is an ideal situation, but I think that a lot of work is being done. For example, we have for the first time outlawed domestic child labor in Pakistan by amending the 1991 Child Employment Act. Yes, it's only applicable to Islamabad, the capital territory, but any provincial legislature through a resolution can adopt the same. This is something that never happened. Nobody even looked at domestic labor. And here we have finally managed to proscribe child domestic labor. Our transgender law is one of the most progressive in the world. It's taking time to implement, but it is there and we are in the process of implementing it. So we are trying to do what we can, but there are hurdles along the way, which I must point out. For example, our domestic violence bill has been sitting in the Human Rights Standing Committee headed by Bilawal Bhutto Zardari for the last 5 months. Our senior citizens bill, it's been a year, it is in the standing committee. So this is how Parliament seems to work. It's unfortunate when issues that should be non-controversial become politicized and then they get held up in standing committees and the delay happens. But I think by and large, Pakistani society today is more aware, more active, and more forceful about demanding their rights. And I want one other point. I totally agree, all residents should have rights. And Aitzaz pointed out, yes, of course, citizens have more rights than others. You can't make somebody stateless. And I want to point out that this is an issue I've been raising for a long time. In the UK, this is what the British are doing. They're making people stateless who've got their extremists who've gone to fight ISIS by saying, oh, that person also has nationality by descent. This is extremely dangerous, even if they're not dual nationals. The case of a Bengali woman that because her parents or forefathers came from Bangladesh, so the British found it convenient to strip her of her nationality and said, well, she has nationality by descent. So all over the world, actually, the people who are marginalized on the peripheries of societies are being dealt a blow as far as their human rights goes. And I think if you look at it holistically, we need to fight that trend. Of course, we must begin at home. And I again want to talk about our minorities. There are issues with our minorities, which we have to deal with. We cannot keep marginalizing them. But at least those issues are now being discussed. And in Parliament, the parliamentary committees looking at forced conversions. We're looking at child marriages. We also have to do things in our constitution. If you look at our 73 constitution, for example, there's no clarity on how we define a child. A child at the age of 14 can work, But yet you have said in Article 25, I think it is, that a child is to be provided free education up to 16. There's a problem right there. We have to sort that out. So there's work that has to be done on multiple levels, but I think that there is definitely a sort of a spirit to be able to now move towards ensuring the fundamental rights of all citizens, as a starter, all citizens, that are enshrined in your constitution. Because if you're not going to, then the constitution becomes a meaningless piece of paper.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mazari. I think that's an excellent segue into the next topic of discussion. And I think we've talked a lot about the actual internalization and the culture of rights that needs to change. And I think we're going to get onto that as a next question. But for now, I want us to pause for a moment. Dr. Mazari, you mentioned the different government initiatives in respect to fundamental rights that are being introduced. But let's take a step back and think about the Constitution of Pakistan, as you mentioned. Now, is the Constitution of Pakistan sufficient for the fundamental rights protection? Because, I mean, there are a number of basic points to mention here. The present Constitution contains rights, but peppers them with all sorts of caveats. You get the right to freedom of expression, but that's subject to restrictions imposed by law. You can assemble, but you can't disrupt public order. You can have religious beliefs and profess them, but that's also subject to public order. All these peppered caveats and exceptions seem to be a trend in the constitutional arrangements for fundamental rights. It may even seem like the only human right that is absolute and codified is the right to public order. You can even look at Article 8 of the Constitution. I think Barrister Aitzaz mentioned this point about laws inconsistent with fundamental rights that would be void. But this doesn't apply to members of the armed forces or the police that are discharged with actual duties. So that becomes, when you think about enforcement, if the fundamental rights chapter exists, is that even sufficient for protection? Why don't I bring in Ms. Reema Omer on this point? Let's think about reform. Let's think about change. And before I invite Ms. Reema to speak, I'd like to ask now everyone to keep contributions short and incisive, because there are lots of questions that are going to be coming in.
Yeah. Raza, absolutely. That's the key question in how our fundamental rights chapter is framed. The right is expressed in a few words, and the exceptions are contained in a long list. To make matters worse, when the restrictions are supposed to be imposed by law, we now see executive bodies such as PEMRA, such as PTA. They have taken these exceptions into their own hands, and they say they can, through executive orders, restrict rights because the Constitution allows them to do so. PEMRA has recently passed a whole bunch of orders, I think completely going beyond their authority, arguing that, well, the fundamental rights provisions in the Constitution, freedom of speech is not absolute, and they're allowed to do it. So I think this is a key cause of concern. We need the restrictions to be far more limited, as they are in the ICCPR, for example. If you just compare Pakistan's constitutional fundamental rights provisions with the ICCPR, you'll notice there are huge discrepancies. We have far more limitations, and the way they're interpreted is also against how it is recommended that such limitations are interpreted under international law. We do not have requirements for necessity. If there are any less severe means available, you cannot restrict fundamental rights. But in Pakistan, we don't ask these questions. Are there other options? Is it proportionate, what you're doing to what you're trying to address? Is it necessary? Are you discriminating in how you are applying those limitations? We don't ask those questions. So absolutely, that needs to be corrected. Then citizens versus residents. On some issues, yes, you can apply certain rights only for citizens, but freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, under international human rights, so that framework, these rights, and you can see the UK Human Rights Act, you can see the European Convention on Human Rights, the South African Constitution, they do not make these distinctions between citizens and residents. Finally, I think when we're talking about the Constitution, it would be very wrong of me not to mention that we exclude Ahmadis from their expression of their right to freedom of religion entirely. And the state has taken upon itself to decide who is a Muslim, who isn't, and a whole bunch of human rights violations that follow. It's difficult to talk about this in Pakistan, but when you speak about the constitution, it would be a huge disservice to the cause of human rights not to mention this. Also, Raza, now this amendment has lapsed, but for many years in Pakistan, we had a constitutional provision that said people who are accused of certain terrorism-related offenses can be tried by military courts which are completely opaque in their procedures, where judgments of the Peshawar High Court and other courts have said that there's been torture, people are not given any trial whatsoever. People who were previously forcibly disappeared just turned up in these courts and confessed to committing all sorts of terrorist attacks. We've had dozens of people who've been executed because of decisions of these courts. And not too long ago, this was part of our constitution. So when Dr. Mazari says that aspirationally, people may just say a few words that are against human rights, but the Pakistani state does not adopt that, I think this example contradicts that. Pakistan was the only country in the region where people accused of terrorism were being tried by opaque military courts for many years. Even though those constitutional provisions have lapsed now, what happened to those people, we still don't know. So these are huge issues. Enforced disappearance as well, my last comment, Raza. We had a commission established in 2011 on enforced disappearances in Pakistan. It has been 9 years. Just a couple of months ago, that commission's mandate was once again extended. How many people the commission is required to investigate and to fix responsibility for enforced disappearance? Truth is important, tracing whereabouts is important, but fixing accountability. Who are these individuals or institutions responsible who abduct people and disappear them in Pakistan? Guess how many people have been brought to justice? Zero in 9 years. And there are huge problems with this commission's mandate, with how it operates. Yet the mandate stays the same and the commission keeps on getting more and more and more extensions. Why? So, I mean, these are questions we have to deal with. I'm grateful to Dr. Mazari. She has always talked about enforced disappearances. But when it comes to fixing responsibility, who will do that? You know, Matiullah Jan, a journalist, was abducted from Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan. What has happened? The Prime Minister in an interview said he did not know about it. The government says they're not responsible. My last point here, democracy and human rights. In Pakistan, we have a crisis. We do not know who holds power and who should be held responsible when they exercise that power in a wrong way, right? There is that confusion. When I, as an ICJ employee, if I have to write a press statement on an abduction, do I say the government is responsible? In many cases, I know I can't, because I know the perpetrators lie elsewhere. The Supreme Court in a judgment has said the way the state machinery operates is very Kafkaesque. That is the word the Supreme Court uses. So I think this is how I will link with this with democracy, that it is time that we should know that the people we elect are the ones who make decisions in this country, so that we can hold them accountable. Because human rights with impunity cannot be protected. If people breach human rights, they have to be held to account. If they're not held to account, that cycle of breach will continue. In Pakistan, given how our system is set up, responsibility lies elsewhere, but power seems to be somewhere else. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for those incisive remarks, Ms. Reema Omer. I think you raised a number of important points. Now, I'm going to bring in Barrister Aitzaz Ahsan Saab, and on the specific point of, is it time to bring in a further amendment to Pakistan's constitution in respect of reforming fundamental rights, taking out these numerous exceptions that make these rights not absolute, but conditional on several fronts, so the state can always rely on some exemption of public order, public morality, disruption to say that actually we could lock this person, we could sort of arrest them. That's completely fine because the constitution doesn't give them an absolute right to assemble, to express freely. Is it time for a constitutional amendment?
there's always time for constitutional amendments and improvement in constitution, but I don't think that that is really what is at the root of the issue. The root of the issue is not the letter of the law. The letter of the law is still more pious than it is being applied. It is still more liberating and based on freedoms than are being actually provided to the citizen. And I agree entirely with what Reema has said. She's very, with precision and with an adequate number of precise examples, established all her points, and I ditto all those points, and I ditto her entire statement. But I would like to add is that where we actually, this is a conference in which we are not necessarily prosecuting any particular government. Otherwise, I would say that while the human rights law may have remained in the committee, but the human rights that are available, how much are they being applied? There is a Journalist Protection Act that is being drafted and has gone through the processes of legislation partly or completely. But are the journalists protected? Do the journalists have the right of freedom of expression? Matiullah Jan is the case, for instance, that Reema pointed out, is a very pertinent case. And to the point, does the media have the freedom that the Constitution, even the Constitution, despite all the caveats, allows to it? Does it have that? Is it not true that today the media is run on a 30 seconds to 1 minute time lag, and there is somebody, while I'm talking to you and it's going live, it's going delayed by a minute, in which somebody is sitting there in the projection room or the broadcast room, whatever they call it, in the actual on the actual keyboard, and he presses a key. He has a time of 1 minute to determine which phrase to silence, and the speaker just goes like this, as I was saying. Now, this is a total denial of human rights. But I would like to emphasize still the fact that the society accepts this, and the society, in fact, condones a lot of violations of human rights. There is normally a what in language attributed to a term attributed to Chaudhry Shujaat Hussain, senior leader, senior politician, and former prime minister, miti pao, just sort of bury this issue. If she's been raped, never mind, forget it. And this is what people come and will advise the victims' family members. And there is this element of condonation, this element of acceptance of this as a social norm, as a social necessity, the honor issue, or several other such issues, where you just go in and do a panchayati sort of a decision, which means that you just try to bring a compromise between the party. This non-recognition of rights that are fundamental to the citizen by even their family members is the real source of the violation of these rights. If people were vigilant about their rights and the rights of their own family members, there would be less of violations. And we have to have more education. we have to have curriculum based on human rights. There should be a human rights subject being taught in schools after the 5th class at least. And girls have to be educated. Girls have to be a girl who grows up with the knowledge of her rights and becomes a woman, becomes a mother, will then defend her daughter also. And in a time of when the mother can become the critical balance between pro and against victim, female victim, or a child victim. So I think we have to address it also on the plane of social attitude. The laws, despite the laws, whatever rights are available are not even being allowed to the citizen these days.
Thank you, Barrister Saab. I think these are incredible points as to the culture of rights, as you mentioned, on a societal plane. I want to bring in Dr. Shireen Mazari now, and I want to ask, I mean, there are some brilliant proposals being put forward on the legislative agenda in respect of rights in Pakistan. But is it time for a more step back and actually looking back at the 73 Constitution and saying, there's so many restrictions, why don't we just bring them in line with international standards? Why don't we just limit these exceptions so that these rights can actually be enjoyed by Pakistanis and residents?
I think to begin with, we have enough on our agenda to enforce what is already there in the Constitution. Of course, constitutional amendments are always welcome if they improve the situation further. But if we wait for constitutional amendments where the whole procedure of 2/3 majority and so on, that might happen when you have a government that comes in and controls both the houses. But at least let's implement what is there. I want to refer to the military courts issue. Absolutely. Military courts are not tenable in a democracy. And we were under pressure when our government came in to renew the military courts. We did not renew them. And I think that was a good thing. The other thing is, yes, PEMRA and other bodies, PTA, whatever, if they are overshooting, the good thing is that people have the right to appeal, go to courts. Now, recently, the social media rules are in court, and let's see what happens to them. So you have the right to redress. I agree. These organizations should work within their domain. And if they're not doing it, then those situations should be rectified. I am not, as I said at the start, we are not in an ideal situation, nor have we been for a very long time. But as long as we're taking steps forward, I think that shows that there is a commitment and recognition. And as for the who's going to be responsible, will it be the government or not? Frankly, Reema, I'm very clear in my mind. At the end of the day, in a democracy, the civilian government has to be held responsible. So it is up to the government to take charge and to be responsible. I see no two ways on that. That has been my view. I have expressed it in cabinet. That has been my view, which has led me to introduce certain legislation. And I would not have been able to do that. Our ministry would not have been able to do any of that legislation, even if it's not yet turned into law, if the Prime Minister's support was not there. On the Enforced Disappearance Commission, in our committee that has now been formed to discuss this issue, we have raised this point that the TORs of that commission and the way it functions leaves a lot to be desired. The committee that is there, which decides what will be regarded as enforced disappearance, the composition of that committee needs to be changed, needs to be expanded. These are things that are being discussed now. And I think, frankly, that these should have been discussed post-Musharraf when democracy came back. But still, it's not too late, and we have to modify and change so these organizations really become more effective. There's no two ways about it. As I keep saying, we're not perfect. There are a lot of issues. And as Aitzaz also keeps saying, we also have to change people's mindsets and thinking. And in that, I want to add, as a woman, I find it the societal approach to how we deal with women. We look at a woman as a mother, as a sister, as a wife. Why? A woman should be regarded as a woman in her own right, irrelevant. We don't look at a man as a husband or a brother. So why do we, so, we have to change. Even our women, when some of them they talk about, she's a sister and she has been robbed of her honor. She's been robbed of her honor as a woman. Why should the sister factor or the wife or the mother factor come in? So, and I want to also inform Aitzaz that in the new curriculum, which of course is also being debated, but now human rights is going to be taught as a subject, environmental studies and human rights, two compulsory subjects that are going to be taught from the primary level onwards. So that is something that is a new addition, and we hope that that will create an awareness about rights from children, because if we teach our children, then we will have an easier job as they grow up. So, there are societal issues we have to tackle, societal mindsets. We have to reform institutions that are not functioning as they should be functioning or that are overstepping the bounds. And we as a government have to recognize that in a democracy, the civilian government has to be responsible. Just as we take credit for the good things we do, we must take responsibility for lapses, and we want to overcome those lapses. And I think we're a government that has a very open sort of democratic cabinet structure where cabinet meets every week. This is unusual in Pakistan. Every Tuesday there's a cabinet meeting that goes on for hours, and there's an open debate in there, and we discuss our shortcomings and try to see how we can make things better. There are different viewpoints always, but at the end of the day, the government as a whole, federal government, has to be the entity that is responsible for what happens in the country. And I think, to me, there's no two ways about thinking. And I think that the Prime Minister does take responsibility. When on the Matiullah case that everybody's citing, when he said he didn't know, and the moment he found out, that is when this committee on enforced disappearance came into being, that this was not acceptable. So those who act outside of the law and outside of the government boundaries even, they also need to now be dealt with. So at the end of the day, good or bad, this is the government's responsibility. We have been elected by the people to govern Pakistan.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Mazari. Again, very pertinent points. And what we're now going to do is move to the Q&A, because a number of questions have been trickling through our live viewers, and we have 20 minutes left to wrap this up. So I would request everyone to keep answers short and concise. So I think the first point is we're going to move to the idea of the culture of rights. I think Barrister Ahsan and Dr. Shireen Mazari, you both made the point about education and human rights conscious education from a very early age. But let's take this up to the next level. What about police officers and state officials? Should they also be made to think in a human rights conscious way as part of their professional training, so that when incidents like the motorway gang rape happened in Lahore, rather than Lahore capital city police officer responding that, she was there on the motorway at the wrong time, this is not France, the perspective and the response would have been informed by human rights considerations as opposed to blaming the victim. And I should mention this question is directed to Dr. Shireen Mazari first.
Absolutely. And one of the jobs that our ministry is doing is police sensitization on gender-based violence, on child abuse, and on transgenders, because we are focusing a lot on abuse of transgenders also. And police sensitization is very critical. And if you recall, after the CCPO's absolutely unacceptable statement, a lot of us condemned it outright. that this is absolutely not acceptable. He fumbled and made some sort of apologetic thing, but the fact of the matter is our government takes note of these things. We make publicly condemn also, as well as in the cabinet. And sensitization of police, of the judiciary also, by the way, especially the lower judiciary. And we're doing that. There's a Judicial Academy where we've held sensitization programs. We've held them in Islamabad, and we are continuing to do that, because without that sensitization, the other thing is we are now pushing for, and our government is now moving towards hiring more women police officers, because we need more women police officers, especially to deal with crimes like gender-based violence or child abuse. So that's the other thing that the government is now moving towards, to ensure that you have more police officers, women police officers.
Dr. Shireen Mazari, there's another question that's come in for you. This is from Maria Malik, and she touches on a point that Ms. Reema Omer mentioned earlier on in her statements. Maria says, as an Ahmadi Muslim, I feel unsafe in my own country when I hear about 31-year-old Dr. Tahir Ahmed and 82-year-old Mehboob Khan being victims of hate crimes against Ahmadis. I see you raise your voice for the rights of Kashmiris or Palestinians and people outside Pakistan. But what are you actively doing to reduce the religious discrimination against the Ahmadi community in Pakistan?
Okay. The reason that I publicly raise issues like Palestine and the Kashmiris, because I don't think Kashmir is outside of Pakistan's concern, is because we can't take action as such. But issues like minorities or women, abuse, we are the government, so we have to take action, not make statements. So let me just clarify, that's one reason. On the Ahmadiyya issue, our constitution has declared them as minorities. And like all other minorities, they need to be protected. Their places of worship need to be protected, and their rights as minorities need to be protected. Now, whether what's in the constitution is acceptable or not to certain people, that's a different debate altogether. But the fact of the matter is that Pakistan sees the Ahmadis as a minority group, as it sees Christians and Hindus and Sikhs and other minorities. So I think within that, every citizen should be protected. And I don't know whether Maria has seen, but the Prime Minister's a special representative on interfaith harmony has given a very strong statement condemning the Ahmadi attacks that have happened in Nankana and in Lahore. And he is now meeting with representatives from the Ahmadiyya community and from meeting the ulama to sort out. And he has said categorically that the state has to protect all its citizens equally. Their lives, their security is part of the responsibility of the state.
Thanks, Dr. Mazari. I want to push this point forward because while it's all good to talk and discuss and think about these issues, just in August, the district administration in Lahore sealed an Ahmadi prayer center after local clerics objected to Ahmadis being allowed to pray openly. This seems to be a very transactional relationship vis-a-vis Ahmadi rights, where you have to make compromises and exchanges with local parties and concerned clerics before giving them their fundamental rights as guaranteed by the Constitution of Pakistan. I mean, human rights are meant for these situations when people are being oppressed and not being able to worship other places of worship.
Is that for me?
Yes, exactly. Just a follow-up point, because
okay,
I mean,
after devolution on this particular issue, to be very honest, I knew about it and the Punjab government was dealing with it. But basically, as happens with minorities everywhere, we are seeing shrinking spaces all across the world. But of course, our problem is first and foremost in Pakistan. And as I said earlier, there are lapses, there are people are victimized, but at the end of the day, yes, the state has to protect all its citizens, regardless of which group they belong to. And the state needs to therefore strengthen its machinery for being able to provide that protection. And I think with this new gentleman who's come to take action on interfaith harmony, as it's called, we will be seeing movement towards improvement on that as well. So I think that, yes, there are very serious issues. But also, by the way, while we're talking of minorities, let me point out there are some good things that the state of Pakistan has done. For example, the Hindus and the Christians are allowed their own personal laws. And unfortunately, we have 17 Christian denominations, and our Christian marriage and divorce bill, which was finally ready after we met 200 different representatives, has been stalled because one group of the Christian community has said that's not acceptable to them. So we're trying to now deal and talk to them. But this is something that we have done, which not every country does. So when we, the good things also should be pointed out. Not everything is all black. Pakistan has moved forward in a number of fields, but yes, there are challenges. And as long as we accept that these are challenges, these are problems, and we need to resolve them, then at least we have a determination to try and resolve them. Will they be resolved in a day? I don't think so. I think it will take time. You have to change people's mindsets and acceptance. And after years, after the Zia period and the polarization that exists in our society today, we really have to work towards ending that polarization and again recreate acceptance of the other, which was there in Pakistan till the black period of the Zia dictatorship, sadly.
Thank you, Dr.
Raza, if I may just add a short point.
Sure.
Dr. Mazari is one of the more progressive, very strong, courageous voices in our cabinet. But I have to say, and it really upsets me to say this, that the government, by and large, seems to be appeasing those people who are the perpetrators of these crimes. And I can point to various examples. Dr. Mazari said, according to our constitution, Ahmadis are minorities. There is a commission on religious minorities in Pakistan. Why does that commission not have Ahmadis as minority members? What happened when they were proposed to be on that commission? What happened with Atif Mia? What happens when they're charged with blasphemy, Ahmadi people mostly, no one is willing to take up their case. They are tortured when in detention. And why? Because of a text message, because of an argument they have with someone else, and that gets blown out of proportion and is called blasphemy. And in Pakistan, if you are accused of blasphemy, you can just forget about any rights whatsoever because it's such a taboo subject, it's so sensitive. We have Junaid Hafiz, who has been in detention, in prison for nearly 10 years now. Why? Because he asked some difficult questions in front of his students. I once tweeted, I will give you my example, that we want to have a global blasphemy law. I asked questions, there are various religions, how are you going to address all those beliefs in such a blasphemy law? One minister of this government retweeted a tweet which had said I had committed blasphemy and I should be prosecuted because I asked that question. This is the environment we're living in, and I'm sure a lot is being done. However, what I see is appeasement, because people who perpetrate these crimes, at the end of the day, it seems that the government needs them for other things. The Council of Islamic Ideology. Why is it that the government sends a lot of proposed bills to the Council of Islamic Ideology when it's not really their role? They're an advisory body. But it seems like now they've become a supra-parliamentary body. And if they do not approve anything, nothing will happen. I know people are trying, and there are people like Dr. Mazari. However, this is the reality, Raza, and it's not just to paint everything as black. When you interact with victims of such crimes on a daily basis, you have to raise this point whenever you get a platform. Unfortunately, try doing this in Pakistan, you will be accused of blasphemy, and then the government, even your best well-wishers, the most people with the best hearts who have the right attitude, the right rights respecting, mindset, even they won't be able to help you. So let's acknowledge this, that maybe as people who are in positions of privilege, we can have these discussions here. But as we speak, they're real people whose lives are being affected by these attitudes and these laws. And unfortunately, the government does not do much to actually help them.
I just want to interject. This is factually incorrect. Our government has not sent a single bill to the Council of Islamic Ideology. In the last parliament, this issue was raised by Maulana Shirani, who was then head of the CII, and he insisted bills go. And even at that time, we protested and the bills were not sent. And our government has not sent any bill. I can tell you, it is no advice bill has gone that has been tabled in Parliament and then gone to the Council of Islamic Ideology for advice. Yes, for example, on gender-based violence, I asked Qibla Ayaz, who heads the council, to give us a statement against gender-based violence, which he did, and we used. But to say that the government is sending bills to the Council of Islamic Ideology before tabling, that is factually not correct, and I want to correct you.
I can give examples. Underage marriage, changing the age of marriage.
No, it didn't. No,
and
it didn't.
Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, maybe not the federal. Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Assembly domestic violence law. Domestic violence law did.
No. Our domestic violence bill was tabled by us, and it went to the standing committee on the issue of underage marriage. Sadly, it was tabled in Parliament, and it was defeated before it could even go to committee across the board. All the male MNAs from all parties, PPP, one male MNA, but from the other parties, all the male MNAs opposed it, and all the women MNAs supported it, but we were in a minority. But there was no question of the it being sent to the Islamic ideology. Neither did that proposal gain coinage. The bill unfortunately got defeated at the very first stage because the men from across the opposition aisles and the government aisles by and large opposed it, and unfortunately they had the majority.
Thank you, Dr. Mazari. And Ms. Reema Omer, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Ms. Reema Omer's question is touching on the politics of appeasement in respect of the protection of the Ahmadi community. And that's just a more broader systemic issue. When you look at the appointment of Atif Mia and the sort of government reversal very quickly based on the sort of corners in Pakistan that were objecting to the appointment of Atif Mia, that's a clear issue just because on the basis that he was an Ahmadi Muslim. Now, the other point I would like to make on this issue is that if you look at the National Commission in respect of minorities, which Ms. Reema Omer again pointed out earlier, there was objection to them being even included based on the idea that they don't accept the Constitution of Pakistan. So it seems like it's the dehumanization of Ahmadi people that is the crux of the problem. It's not that they just are like any other minority. It's a dehumanization that's going on in Pakistan. So Dr. Mazari, what would be your response?
I just wanted to tell you that yes, there was a debate on that. Our ministry's point of view was categorical on that issue. But our point of view was not the majority point of view in the cabinet. But I think that there is a rethinking on that. And Tahir Ashrafi Sahab is re-examining that issue of the Minorities Commission and its constitution. But the other thing that did happen was that instead of it being loaded with government officials and Muslims, the Minority Commission is headed by a member of the minority community, and the majority of the members are now from the other minority communities. Steps are being taken forward. Things don't change overnight. These are not issues that have come up overnight either. They have arisen, and the changes in when the constitution was changed in the 73 constitution. So the excess baggage can't suddenly be removed overnight till you change people's thinking. The mindsets have to also change. You can't bring about something that by and large the majority will not accept. You have to also convince the majority. And that is an equally important part of furthering human rights alongside legislation and implementation of legislation.
Thank you, Dr. Mazari. And I'd like to bring Barrister Aitzaz Ahsan on this point. I think you mentioned earlier on in your opening statements regarding the medieval stage that we carry on remaining in as a society and culture. How do we transcend the medieval stage and actually move to a popular consensus amongst the people residing in Pakistan that human rights are for everyone and not for the few?
Well, actually, I've been making this point I thought I'd labored on this point rather too much and too insistently. But my entire point is this, and Reema is right in this situation when it applies to the particular minority, the Ahmadis, for instance, that what is stated in the law, the protections that the law allows to minorities are actually in effect in the societal context are not allowed to them. And in fact, society just takes the law into its own hands. It goes and burns down their homes or their premises. And the whole thing is then sort of condoned and forgotten. And but this is a societal attitude. Have we not forgotten the Saiwal murders, where both the parents were murdered, and I still wonder how those two young children, one 3-year-old, one 5-year-old, are doing or have done since. But it's forgotten. It's not on the debate. The two Christians were thrown into a furnace. To the young couple in Kasur, thrown into a furnace, a burning furnace. We've forgotten that. So actually we forget because there is no real sense of outrage left in us. And the attitudes are, of course, medieval, patriarchal. So they kind of condone, they kind of accept this illogical logic. But now this has to be addressed. And I think across the lines, while I find it quite a situation that, a comic situation, in fact, that Matiullah Jan gets arrested and the Prime Minister is not aware of it until several days later. It's brought to his notice, and then he has I must say, the candor to admit the fact that he was not aware of it. But as a minister who had been in charge of human rights under the under Benazir Bhutto Shahid's first government in 1988, as interior minister and law minister, and then as Dr. Mazari has pointed out, the human rights was a part of the interior ministry and not of the law ministry, law and justice ministry, and not independent of which it is now. But and this was also done by our subsequent government. But the fact is that in the morning, at least by 8 o'clock, I would have spoken at least twice to the Prime Minister on the situation. If I didn't ring her up, she would have rung me up and inquired about the state of the condition of the state, or the state of Pakistan, and major events that might have happened the day before or the night before or during the night. And I had to be precise and to provide her the information. But again, I would really conclude my submissions in this, is that we have to, we are looking into with good intentions into the box of human rights, but there is a box of society which we must explore also. What are the conditions that are shaping our society? And there are a whole lot of conditions that are shaping our society, including ignorance, fatalism, resignation to authority, the lack of sense of outrage. Under Ayub Khan, sugar prices went up by 4 annas and the entire population was out. There was a sense of outrage. The British and the French armies invaded Suez, which is 3,000 miles from Pakistan or 2,000 miles from Pakistan, and all Pakistanis were out on the streets. irrespective of which party they belong to. Now that sense of outrage has gone, and we have to become more vigilant, more knowledgeable about the human rights, and have a population that is more knowledgeable and more sensitive to the violation of human rights.
Pertinent comments. And I think
Raza, 30, can I just
I
speak
think we have to
30
wrap up,
seconds?
but
30 seconds.
please take 30 seconds and then we'll wrap up.
Yes, I just wanted to link this to what I said earlier about people who now are in parliament, ministers, when they speak about violating human rights in parliament, in their speeches, on television. What do you think? What kind of effect does that have trickle down on the people, on society, on people, administrators who we're not now talking about? So I think when we speak about the culture of human rights, it also has to start from the top. And unfortunately, I see that missing. And this is why for me, it's such a huge issue that people who are ministers are saying these things with impunity in parliament, where they're supposed to be doing the opposite. So it's not a question like initially, and Dr. Mazari said, at least it doesn't translate into law, but it does translate into attitude. That for me is the big problem.
But one sentence, just one sentence. And that is my very point. The point is that it's not just at the top, but we are an entire society. We are 22 million people, to 220 million people as a whole, which is not just the parliament and parliamentarians or the police officer sitting in the police station, but people as a whole. Generally, we have become a non-rights society. Yes. And that is where we have to begin with also, or at least multiply our efforts.
Absolutely. But let's not forget, duty bearers are state officials when it comes to human rights.
Absolutely.
People can commit crime, but it's the state that has to protect human rights.
And just on this
state
point,
officials are from amongst us, and they will carry the same values
sure,
as we
absolutely.
do.
I agree, absolutely.
And just on this point, Dr. Mazari, I mean, this is linking back to the elected representatives, the civilian government. We are hopeful that the civilian government will continue to introspect and take responsibility as for fundamental rights and really embrace it, internalize it, so it can be trickled down to eventually the citizens of Pakistan. And that's how you build popular consensus. So we are optimistic that, Dr. Mazari, you have come here today and you've explained the government's agenda. But now with a bit of thinking and argumentation, I think we've arrived at the consensus that to bring this forward, maybe it is time for the government to continue to take that responsibility and really embrace it, so that when you are at the government stage, people are all watching, all eyes are on you, and that's where you lead from the front. Dr. Mazari, we have to close there, but I'll give you just one closing statement remark, just as I done for the two others.
I agree absolutely that we have to introspect, we have to take the lead, but we also, society has a responsibility also. And I agree with Aitzaz that the sense of outrage in our society has to be there. And that outrage, unfortunately, is not there. If it is there, it's there for a very limited time, and then another issue comes up and you get detracted. But we're talking of human rights. Let's not forget that, yes, there are these controversial issues also, but there are other very basic human rights on which a lot of work is being done, providing basic necessities to people, health, insurance, education. These are also equally important. And I think that for the ordinary citizen, these issues are at the moment of much greater importance. Whether we agree that they should be or they shouldn't is a different issue. But these also are of great importance to the general public, to the citizen. And therefore, we have to look at progress being made there as well, and also do introspection on a lot of other issues that are controversial, but where the government has to take the lead and ensure that all its citizens get the rights to which we are committed as a nation according to our constitution.
Indeed. Thank you, Dr. Mazari. Thank you, Barrister Aitzaz, and thank you, Ms. Reema Omer, for a fascinating discussion. I will hand over to Mustafa now for any closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Raza. On that note, I'm extremely grateful to all of our speakers, Dr. Shireen Mazari, Barrister Aitzaz Ahsan, and Ms. Reema Omer, for taking part in our panel on fundamental rights. Courageous women like Dr. Shireen Mazari and Ms. Reema Omer, who are not afraid to bend to the patriarchal culture, can resolve violation of human rights. As Barrister Aitzaz Ahsan so aptly put, real success will be when we change the medieval patriarchal mindset of our society. It was indeed a very intellectual and stimulating discussion, which I'm sure our viewers greatly benefited from. A special thank you to Raza for moderating this session in a very professional and coherent manner. Our next session is going to take the shape of a virtual town hall, and it will feature the Special Assistant to the Prime Minister on Overseas Pakistanis and Human Resource Development, Mr. Syed Zulfikar Bukhari. For those of you who registered for the conference, the link to that session should be in your emails. Nevertheless, it will be streamed live on our Facebook page. I guess that's all from the first panel of the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2020. It was indeed a delight to host you all. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.